I'm Dr. Kelly, aka Victorian Shark. You can find me by that handle on Twitter. Hey. And I am a Victorianist, and I'm interested in fantasy, science fiction, pop culture, gender, sexuality, all kinds of stuff. Fun stuff, really fun stuff. So today I want to talk with you about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Full title, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I have the Barnes & Noble Classic edition, so if I mention a page number, which I might, it is from this edition. I like these because they are really cheap and pretty straightforward, and they have pretty good notes. So pretty decent stuff there. So we're just gonna get rolling. Dr. Lauer invited me to talk with you today, given the sort of strange coronavirus, COVID-19 situations. I thought it might be nice for you all to have a change of scenery, do a little guest star action kind of thing. And it's fun for me because I really love this stuff. Also, this is Dobby, if you can see him. We're like attached at the hip, so he's probably gonna just like hang out for the whole video. All right, let's get rolling. So Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has kind of entered the general cultural bank of knowledge, right? You kind of hear, oh, he's a real Jekyll Hyde, or, you know, he's got split personalities like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, or he just snapped like Jekyll and Hyde. So what I really love about this, though, is when you don't know the whole story. So if you read this and didn't know, spoiler, like, I mean, you've read it by now, right? But spoiler, they're the same person. If you didn't know that before now, it's like mind-blowing. I love that moment where everything clicks and it's like, oh, he changes before my eyes, and they're the same person. So it's a really fun story. I'm always shocked every time I reread it at how violent it is. He's like beating down children in the street and like murdering people, and it's a little wild. And the Victorians really thought so too. The Victorians were fascinated by this story. So when this came out in the late 19th century, what was really popular were these kind of big, thick, really thick. I've got a couple up here. You can see how thick some of these are. Novels that were very realistic. They were about largely gender and marriage. There's a huge theme in a lot of them that we even have a name for it. It's called the marriage plot. And a lot of them were about class, like Charles Dickens is really famous for that, right? Thinking about class earlier in the century. And then at the end of the century, we get a lot to do with sexuality and deviance and weird stuff. Great weird stuff. A lot of things like mysticism, magic, and what we would consider science fiction. So Jekyll and Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson is considered a novella. And what that means, well, by some people, there's like, nobody really knows where to draw the line. What that means, though, is that it's shorter than a novel, but it's not a short story. It's longer than a short story, shorter than a novel. So novella, however you want to pronounce it. And that you can call it a novel. It's fine. Nobody knows where that line, there's no like page number because there's so many different editions with so many different numbers of pages, etc., right? Who knows? I've heard of it called a novella, though, in most places. It's also what's called epistolary, which means that at least part of it is written as letters. And this was kind of a not uncommon technique for novels at the time, throughout the Victorian age and even a little earlier, because it was a really easy way to get a first-person point of view where your narrator is a character, right? So we get these letters from Lanyon and Dr. Jekyll himself, right? So those little bits at the end are what's called epistolary. We're going to talk about kind of like how this thing is strung together in a little bit. So the other thing that's really funny about this story is its origins, which are kind of wild. So late Victorians were, like I said, starting to get into some weird stuff. And they did a lot of drugs, and they had a lot of sex. And people don't normally think that about Victorians, but it's true. So at the time, one of the rumors about how the story was written is that Stevenson had a kind of drug-fueled fever dream, wrote this entire story in one day, which is super, super fast, and then read it to his wife, and his wife was like, oh, that's pretty rad, like, yeah, A+. And mentioned that it seemed allegorical, which we'll also come back to. And he threw it in the fire. He was like, blah, 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 blah. I don't know. He just, that for some reason irked him. He threw it in the fire. It was gone. And then he kind of thought about it, and he was like, oh, actually, that's pretty good. That's a good thing. So then he rewrote it again in, I've heard a day, but definitely less than a week. Less than a week, he wrote this whole thing again. And he kind of had it in his head then that his wife had said, hey, that sounds like an allegory. So the second time he wrote through it, he had that fresh in his mind. So it did end up rather allegorical. So the other thing that I think is really important for background for thinking about Jekyll and Hyde is more of the Victorian context in regards to science and technology. So the genre, I think, is pretty firmly science fiction, but what I'm interested in is separating or discovering the ties between the science and the fiction. So the science, Victorians were all about the science. This was like a huge boom for science. We got things like trains, telegraphs, all kinds of things happening, factories, right, which relied on big heavy machinery and coal power, that kind of thing. We got Darwin publishing in the 1860s, which made everybody want to just organize everything. Put everything in a taxonomy, right? You know, about like genuses and species and like the whole way down, organize everything. So that impulse really influenced tons of stuff way beyond just the animal kingdom. And then just after this book, this came out in 1886, just after this is when Freud started writing. So we get taking science from kind of natural sciences or medical sciences and really diversifying. We get tons and tons of fields, including things like psychology. So that's one of the things that comes out of this. Real quick summary. We have like a couple of chapters of like, strange things are happening, and they all seem to be linked to this guy, Mr. Hyde, who seems terrible, and every time he gets described, everyone hates him, but they can't really figure out why. He's just really gross. And Utterson starts to kind of piece things together. He's like, he has strange ties to my buddy, Dr. Jekyll. And then ultimately, in this wild twist, I mean, imagine not knowing that these two are the same person. We get this twist where Lanyon says, you know, in the letter to Utterson after his death, I saw it happen. I saw it. It was terrible. And it spooks him. It scares him literally to death. He receives a shock, right? He says he receives a shock that he will never recover from. So, and then ultimately we get Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. That's what the final portion is called, his full statement of the case. So ultimately we get to hear Jekyll's own account of the story, which is he was real curious about his life and his sort of good and evil sides, or his repressed and liberated sides, And so he pokes around with some chemicals and tries to separate them. Is successful, but then things kind of get out of hand. And he says, like, oh, woe is me. I'm the most miserable man alive. Blah, blah, blah. Like, you brought it on yourself, buddy. So that's a quick summary. That's where we are. Okay. So we're going to bounce back a second to his wife's Stevenson's wife's reaction, which is, hey, that sounds like an allegory. So one of the really common readings of this story is that it's an extended metaphor, which is an allegory, which looks at the duality of man, right? Mankind. So we have a good versus evil theme. Inside every person is a good side and an evil side, and they're constantly battling it out. And then we have the complementary idea of repression, right? You repress your bad side so that you can kind of liberate your respectable side, right? So you choose to do good, right? You have the little angel and the devil on your shoulders, and you choose to listen to the angel. But then the allegorical part is thinking through what happens when you do listen to the devil, or when you become the devil, or when you realize that you're a hypocrite. Because we all have those urges, right? We all have the duality, right? Dual meaning two. Another thing that's really interesting about this with relation to the science is it also separates a man's kind of material body from his spirit or his soul. Jekyll is thinking, like, what could happen if I could separate myself from myself to a certain degree, right? So a different kind of duality. The body changes as the mind changes. So maybe they're not separable. I don't know. Okay, and then this is what I was saying about we would circle back around to the form of the thing, because a lot of people have pointed out that ultimately Jekyll gets in a lot of trouble and dies. Spoiler, he dies. Because he tries to separate his two natures. And similarly, the book kind of can't function without each of its individual little chapters. So we start with some gossip, right? Utterson's out with his bro. They're going for a walk. And he's like, hey, have you ever noticed that door? I heard some stuff go. So we start with this rumor, this kind of gossipy, chit-chat. And then we go through the kind of hearsay. Utterson investigates the Carew murder case, goes with the guy from Scotland Yard, the police officer, to Hyde's apartment. And we get all these different little pieces, and they're strung out across time, but they all work together. They can't be separated, right? Or we wouldn't get the full story. So that's one way that the form actually reflects what's happening in the story. So thinking about how form matters in a lot of literature, that these weird, like very different kinds of chapters can't be separated out, just the same way that Dr. Jekyll can't actually separate himself from Mr. Hyde. Okay, a couple other big themes. It's super gothic. It's amazingly gothic. So you don't really need to know, like, there's always people debating, like, what does that even mean? What is gothic? But go with your gut. Like, it's kind of the kind of thing where, like, you know it if you see it. So there's one passage where Utterson is, I think, on the hunt. Yeah, so he's on the hunt after Sir Carew is murdered. He's on the hunt for Mr. Hyde, and he's like going through the streets, and he's in a cab. And I'm just gonna read you some. I don't know if you can see this. So I have like just scattered words on the page underlined, because sometimes when I'm looking at a big dense paragraph of information or description, just underlining like a word here and there can give me the whole picture. So listen to this. This is Gothic. A chocolate-colored pall, fog, vapors, the cab crawled from street to street. There were a marvelous number of degrees and hues of twilight, dark, evening, glow, like the light of some strange conflagration, right? So it's kind of like those reflections of a fire in some smoke. A haggard shaft of daylight, dismal, muddy, slatternly, which means sloppy, lamps, right? So we have these kind of like little moments of light in the darkness. Like a district of some city in a nightmare. And then he calls it the gloomiest dye, the gloomiest color. So that's Gothic in a nutshell. The whole story is very Gothic. It's who is he? We can't see clearly, right? Kind of a metaphorical fog. And then the last thing I'll mention is the doors as a symbol. So a lot of people have written about this. Doors can be a symbol of crossing over, right? Crossing through. They can be a symbol of not crossing, right? If they remain shut. So the fact that Mr. Hyde has the key to the back door of Dr. Jekyll's place is really noteworthy. So he gives him sort of liberty to pass through this door in and out into his life and out into the world. And then by the end, both of them, because they're the same person, are stuck. They can't cross through the door because Dr. Jekyll is stuck as Mr. Hyde, and Mr. Hyde is wanted for murder. So they can't cross through the door. So thinking about that kind of like the moment of finding a kind of image that then works with the story, kind of like the form does, kind of like the form. Yeah. Okay. So I want to get into thinking about this again as science fiction. So we get the fiction part, yes, but thinking about the science part as well. And what I want to bring to the table is a quote by Arthur C. Clarke, who is a super, super famous sci-fi writer he started writing in the 60s mostly. Probably you've heard of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Clarke wrote the movie / book and then the follow-ups with some other folks, right? There's a lot of people involved with writing movie scripts. So Clarke has these famous, they've been called laws, but the third one is the most famous, and it says, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Meaning basically like if something is so far advanced technology, we can't really tell how it's working. It kind of looks like it's just magic. So fantasy and science fiction then become kind of merged together. So this is a kind of fantastic story where we get this sort of magical outcome of supposedly scientific stuff. Part of what I've looked at in some of my other scholarship is how much work Stevenson does to try to convince us that the science in this book is real. He tries so hard, and it just doesn't, I mean, from our perspective, right, 130 years later, we can tell it's definitely science fiction, heavy on the fiction. But for a Victorian reader, you know, again, they're super interested in science. They have all these new advances. They're getting really interested in thinking about what is science, you know, like how should we do science? It had to be at least quasi-realistic so that readers would stay engaged, right? If it was too wild, if it was too fantastical, if it relied too much on the fiction element, readers probably would have brushed it off. Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I'm speculating, right? But Victorians really liked realism. They liked the Dickens. They liked discussions of class, and they liked portrayals of, the little factory towns or big factory towns and individual people's lives, right? The gritty realism. So this has some of those elements because it wanted to keep Victorian readers engaged. So things like realistic scientific details were really important as Stevenson wrote through this. So the elixir itself that Jekyll uses to turn himself into Hyde and back into Jekyll, is described in a couple of places. So it's described in Lanyon's narrative, right? The little letter in the packet. And it's described again by himself in the final chapter. So we have, this kind of liquid, and he needs a graduated cylinder, like a marked cylinder, science experiment stuff, very realistic. And he has this sort of packet of pre-measured out, he calls them salts, but we know that they're just some kind of like dry, gritty chemical compound. So we get this description of like what's in that drawer that Lanyon goes to get him multiple times, that like these are the key elements. And he even has a log book that he keeps in his laboratory, and that's how he keeps track of his experiments. Like, oh, this time it didn't work, or this time I had to take double, right? That's a warning sign. We know now that science as a way of viewing the world, right, the scientific method, different scientific fields, etc., have become more established. We know that any good experiment should be replicable. And this one's really, really not replicable. So, and he finds that out, like, by the end, he figures out that one of his materials has been polluted, right? It's got some kind of impurity in it, and so therefore he can't replicate this elixir. So the process of turning from Jekyll into Hyde and vice versa is described very scientific, right? He measures out these ingredients, he keeps track of what happens when, and he has this laboratory, right? The setting of the laboratory itself is very scientific. But the outcome is fantastic. The outcome is the magic part, right? So to go back to Clarke's law, for the Victorians, this kind of science would have been so advanced, right? To transform yourself into a whole nother person would have been so advanced that it would have been indistinguishable from magic, right? So sufficiently advanced technology, indistinguishable from magic. So that's part of what Lanyon says. Lanyon's like, no, he's gone crazy. Like, I don't condone anything that he has done. He's gone all metaphysical, right? Which is another way of saying like, ooh, he got a little into like astrology, right? It's a great parallel to astrology. So there are some other like sort of pseudosciences in the text that are worth mentioning. There is a portion where Utterson's assistant has a look. His name is Guest, Mr. Guest, his head clerk, has a look at Hyde's handwriting, and he says, oh, yeah, it's a bad dude. And then a note comes in from Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Guest says, oh, actually, those are the same handwriting. They're just like slanted funny. One of them is slanted differently. So this is called Graphology, and this is part of that Victorian influence, again, to sort of make science everything. So they tried to make everything into science, and some things really didn't need to be science. So they have this sort of study of handwriting, for example, where you could tell a lot about a person from the way they wrote. You could tell if they were good or evil, primarily. They also had a pseudoscience called Phrenology, that's with a PH, Phrenology, where like if they saw the shape of your skull, they could tell you like everything about your personality, but especially if you were a good person or a bad person. So this is kind of like what we have, these same impulses, right? We are not innocent of these impulses because we have astrology, we have all these like, oh, which character are you quizzes online. We still do things like palm readings and tarot readings, all kinds of things that sort of like rely on the idea that there's an underlying something. There's some truth, some underlying truth that can be studied and can be learned, and that may not be true. So graphology is a great example of a pseudoscience, but the phrenology, the being able to sort of judge someone by the shape of their skull, also is really related to how much people judge Mr. Hyde for the way he looks, right? So people freak out about seeing him. They're like, I can't even describe why I hated him so much. He just looked hateable. So that kind of links back to the idea that the Victorians really gave a lot of credence to that. The Victorians believed in it. So if you got kind of like, ooh, the kind of icky feelings from someone, that there must be a reason, there must be a scientific explanation for that. So we have all these kind of pseudo-scientific things, and yet like we in 2020 don't have this potion. So the book really needed an exit strategy. And that's why Stevenson gives us the like, oh, there was an impurity in one of the ingredients, and so we can't actually duplicate this experiment because we don't know what the impurity was. It's very convenient, right? But that's where we get the fiction part of science fiction. Okay, so let me have a look at my notes here. We are rolling right along. Okay, right. Okay, so the magical part is largely the transformation itself, where we get the scientific part is the elixir, and descriptions of the lab, and Dr. Jekyll has 100 titles. He's like a doctor of medicine and a doctor of law, and like all these things. So we're meant to trust him. Excuse me, and we're meant to trust Utterson too. He's like this upstanding, lawyer type. So a lot of the same tensions between the science and the fiction, or what Clarke calls sufficiently advanced technology versus magic, are adapted all the time. So Dr. Lauer told me that you have read The Incredible Hulk, which is awesome and such a good connection. I think what's really interesting about Hulk is that Banner is also this highly accredited doctor, right? And has the sort of similar to the way Dr. Jekyll is set up as like a reliable source and a good scientist. We get that sort of realism from him, so that ultimately, when we get kind of the transformation into the Hulk, we're meant to see like, oh, this is scientific. It's not an accident. It's not, well, you know what I mean? It happens because of certain causes. So the other one that I thought of maybe is from DC. So we get a lot of parallels between Marvel and DC, of course. That's a whole lecture in itself. But thinking about Two-Face, the villain from Batman, because that also has a kind of chemical cause, right? He gets acid thrown on his face. And it leads him to embrace the kind of darker nature in himself. It leads him to embrace the kinds of things that Hyde embraces, to be honest, right? So we have a physical transformation that splits man into his two selves, right? The normal self, the upstanding citizen, and the sort of evil self, the crime lord, the, the villain. So I think it's really interesting that Hulk is a good guy, right? I think that's really interesting. So that's definitely worth, like, put some pressure on that. Like, see where those thoughts get you. The other thing that's great about this whole question of science and magic is comics in general, and a lot of fantasy and sci-fi these days, really play with the idea of like, where's the line between fantasy and sci-fi, right? Where's the line between sufficiently advanced technology and that technology being indistinguishable from magic? And if sufficiently advanced technology looks like magic and sounds like magic and tastes like magic and looks like magic, whatever, then we might as well just call it magic, right? So I think that's really interesting in terms of the Marvel Universe, especially too, thinking about the Avengers, thinking about like, oh yeah, Black Panther, totally, it's because this plant has special chemical properties. Or Tony Stark, right? Oh yeah, he definitely is just really smart, and so he gets to fly around with a magic electronic heart, right? That sounds like magic. There's a ton of these, right? Think about your favorite superheroes, your favorite even supervillains, right? Like Two-Face. Think about how their powers are sort of explained. X-Men is a classic example of this. Their powers are explained by a mutation or a spider bite or whatever. And really, it's kind of just like magic. It's magic. So, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That's Clarke's third law. And I think that it really says a lot that Stevenson's already playing with that in his sci-fi. And here we are, 130 odd years later, and we're still playing with that idea that there's a really fine line that I would not be able to draw the line between technology and magic. Okay, so some final thoughts, questions to leave you with that the book really puts a lot of pressure on. Don't ever give in to temptation or you might never recover. That sounds grim. Or maybe give in to temptation in moderation so that you never end up with a Mr. Hyde. I don't know. Give in a little bit. Is that good advice? I don't know. What is good science versus bad science? So, Dr. Jekyll, for example, tries to keep that log of what he's done and when and how many doses he's had to take or whatever, dates, whatever. But he doesn't even know really the ingredient that's causing the transformation. So tracking, not tracking, selfish versus selfless science, right? Science that's driven by maybe money in our current world, right? Science that is backed by, certain interested groups that might not be unbiased. What is good science and what is bad science? Should science be used to explore the meaning of life / the nature of man? Or maybe should other fields be doing that? Are the humanities the science of people? Is psychology the bridge? Is history the science of the past, right? What is science? Where do the fields help each other? How do they hurt each other? Because in this case, science messed up pretty bad. Okay, and the role of the known, unknown, and unknowable in life. So not everything can be scientifically explained or controlled. Jekyll learns that the really hard way, right? Not everything has a scientific solution. Some things don't have any solutions, right? They just are, or they need to be lived through. And then, this sort of Victorian impulse to organize in order to control. Do we do so much science even today in order to understand our world, in order to control it, right? Inventing plastic and inventing, sort of ways to have clean energy or whatever. Do we do these things in order for us to control our own world. And then really, ultimately, Dr. Jekyll only has control over his story because he writes this letter at the very end, and he has control over his death. So is that maybe the allegory? That we all can only control our own story and our own death. It's kind of a grim note to end on. But that's it. So we are going to end on a grim note. It's Gothic. Let me know if you have questions via either Dr. Lauer or I'm on Twitter as Victorian Shark. And hopefully this was informative and not boring / moderately entertaining. I had fun. Went a little long, but you hung in there. So good job. Hope you enjoyed the story, and good luck with the end of the semester, y'all. You can do it. Okay. Thanks for watching. Bye.